So I want us to go back to the point you were raising, where you said there was a statement that Alice Kaningoni in the book makes about, the status quo being allowed to prevail because of those who have power over others and the instruments that they use in order to suppress marginalized people, particularly women. The book has made an attempt to put women in the front and center of development. The Malawi chapter, for instance, goes as far as trying to tell a story over the years of the status of women's socioeconomic status in Malawi over a number of years. Now, if we were to take a step back and really think about where women in Southern Africa are, where do we find women, and what is their socioeconomic status? You've spent a lot of work through your Institute of Creative Arts for Progress in Africa, speaking to women across the continent and documenting their stories. Where are the women in the economy?
The situation of women in the economy in Southern Africa is miserable. There are one or two exceptions, of course, but these one or two exceptions are the ones that prove the rule. And you'll find that these one or two exceptions are aligned with power. And this really is the issue. Women cannot improve their economic status without the power to do so. And I remember listening to a YouTube video of the Ugandan President Museveni. I never thought I would quote it, because when I heard it, I just thought, oh no, that's terrible, that's irresponsible. But now I understand what he was saying. Mm-hmm. He said that power is a resource. Generally, especially as women, we tend to think that power is a responsibility. Mm-hmm. We have power in order to do things for other people. Mm-hmm. We have to understand that power is also a resource where we can do things for ourselves. And women don't understand that nature of power. So women have to be told that power is yours to take also, so that you can improve your economic status. Without power, no one will listen to you. You will not be able to achieve anything. Mm-hmm. As women, we tend to want to give and keep on giving, and we are shy of taking because that is how we are nurtured. Mm-hmm. And so we find ourselves doing all the dog's labor. We are the ones who take care of the terminally ill. We are the ones who mop up after disasters. We are the ones who prop up dictators by dancing at airports. We are giving and giving. We have to dismantle that kind of thinking that we have and realize that if we even want to be able to continue to give meaningfully, we have to take power. Look at this. What are women suffering from in Zimbabwe at the moment? Mm-hmm. Many women are suffering from the fact that the children have left. I often think about that fairy tale about this person called the Pied Piper, who did a favor for a town, then the town wouldn't pay him, so he played a tune on his pipe and all the children left. Mm-hmm. And this is a similar situation that we are in Zimbabwe. My children have left home. I have two abroad and one in Zimbabwe. The churches, the youth are dwindling. People are leaving home. And so the women are not even able to sustain their families anymore. Wow. So now they have to realize that they have to take power in order to change that. Otherwise, the whole family structure in Zimbabwe is going to be completely destroyed. So that is the important thing. We have to understand that we cannot have economic emancipation without a shift in power.
Right. And I think this is something that feminists have understood very well. But at a really pragmatic level, how do we go about doing that? How do we go about reclaiming power as women, particularly in the economy, in order to claim our space in the economy and claim those economic opportunities? Where do we go? And how do we go about doing this?
Actually, Marx understood all of this when he was talking about false consciousness and alienation, and that this is an individual process. The individual then feeds into the group, but it has to start with the individual. And I think that development ideology has not used those individual processes in the appropriate manner. And I do believe that one reason why development ideology has acted in that way is because of the history where we are coming from, where African people were not seen as fully human. We were 3/5 of a human being or something like that. Did we even have a soul? Maybe we were not even human enough to have a soul. And so in engagement with us, there was no idea that we are dealing with a human being who needs to become what that person has been put down on earth for. So our development interventions are all about outputs.
Right.
Over the course of a year, let's increase the output of this particular crop. Let us increase her economic output in terms of empowering her to make so much peanut butter. Let us give her a sewing machine so that she can make so many school uniforms and sell them. What happens when that force that is acting on this woman leaves? She is still the same person. Nothing has changed within her that enables her to look around in her environment and engage with her environment in a different manner. So this is why I think the development ideology and the processes that emanate from it have not worked. We have to be looking at changing the person. This person was like this at the beginning. What is this person like now? Not only in what they're able to do in order to produce objects, but in their understanding of how they interact with their environment. So while we are teaching them a specific skill, we should also be teaching them to understand how this skill actually fits into the bigger model of the economy.
Yeah. So it's a whole process of conscientization, and again, I think a lot of women's rights organizations that work on questions of economic justice have understood that. Like if you take, for instance, the work that the Rural Women's Assembly does, Women in Mining does, is they spend a lot of time with going through women's political workshops, going through processes that get the women that members of their movement to be very confident to represent their own ideas and so forth. But one of the, and I don't mean to instrumentalize this, and I might get in trouble for asking this question, but in the work that we do as OSISA, we often have to think about questions of scale, right? As individual NGOs and civil society organizations, there's only so many number of women that you can reach. But if we are going to really have this mass movement building, and if we're going to be having change happen at a scale that will actually, in a meaningful way, shift things at a national level or even at a local government level, we have to be able to reach a lot more women than we are at the moment. Where do we go and how do we go about reaching out?
I think there are two ways to do this. You have started working with certain groups of women. Now these groups of women are close to other groups, both going up and going down. So instead of having the one organization that's probably based in one of the big cities doing all that work, now empower these women that you've worked with to speak to the next level down. And they will probably have more meaningful dialogues because their situations in life are closer. So that's one way that you can upscale, I think. And then the other way, of course, is having the products and distributing them through media. Now it's very difficult because the media is controlled in Zimbabwe.
When you say products, what are you referring to in this case?
Well, you can have little documentaries. You can, when you do your trainings, there are ways of packaging those trainings so that you can send them out even to the schools and this kind of thing. Once you have the product, a package that narrates the story and the content that you need, then there's so many ways of distributing them. Of course, the powers that be would not be happy But there's still ways of doing it. This is why things have still continued, even in the circumstances that we find ourselves in Zimbabwe. And that really is the idea behind the Women Filmmakers of Zimbabwe Film Festival, which is called the International Images Film Festival for Women. It was to get those kinds of narratives out to different kinds of people. So I think one has to start taking advantage of technology. This also has been a kind of mental apartheid, if you like, where we have not been thinking of the silent masses in terms of technology. You know, technology is what the hip youth do. But we can rethink that, because, you know, it's not really difficult to have one cell phone per village, you know, for the women, for their use. So that we just have to be innovative about the way we think about it. And I think one of the big issues is that a lot of these programs are not actually devised here. We need a more interactive way of devising these programs, where the partners that we are working with will be more open to listening to us.
Programs in the sense of, when you're talking about programs, what are you referring to?
Interventions on the ground to actually engage with the women. How do we do it? We, you know, for example, when I began the film festival, I was told this is not Paris. You know, or this is not Cannes, you know. So now, when we go to Binga, right, in the Zambezi Valley, and we can get 8,000 people coming to our screenings over the period of 4 or 5 days. People literally walk through the bush with their chairs, you know. It's a way of reaching people. And if you structure your intervention well, with discussions afterwards, and making sure that you always bring it back to people's lived experience, people can achieve wonders, really.
Right. So you're taking us into the next issue that I wanted to talk to you about, and a theme that comes out a lot in this Democratic Developmental States book. It's really around changes in our political cultures. And I like what you've said throughout about, you know, how you bring on board the silent majority, and how we go beyond mainstream media and use other platforms like filmmaking and even
digital platforms.
Digital platforms to get the voices of the silent majority back into the center. But let's talk about, and earlier we talked about social movements. Can we just spend a little bit of time talking about political parties themselves? Because political parties are very strong and they are powerful in really just shaping how citizens, ordinary citizens, engage with politics, and by extension also engage with the politics of decision-making processes on how economic benefits are distributed, how opportunities are being created. How do we go about making political parties work for the citizens?
That is another huge question. I think that sometimes we have to look back in order to understand how to go forward. So for me, what I have been thinking about now is, what does the political party represent to your average, let's say, Zimbabwean? And looking at how political parties function and what the situation of the ordinary citizen is, I ask myself, what has the citizen lost that the political party might be representing? There was that very rapid transition from that tribal society into a colonial state, and now into a postmodern nation state. One generation, 2 generations are not long for that kind of transition to take place. In other parts of the world, this took place over 5 centuries, over a millennium. And now we are expected to do it within 3 generations. Now, 10, 15, 20 years ago, people would have laughed at me. They did laugh at me when I spoke about that. But now we have research in the medical sciences are telling us that actually trauma and experience are actually incorporated into the DNA. So it shows that societies also need to evolve. And we haven't really looked at how we have evolved. We had these really brutal cutoff points. So how has society healed itself? Has society healed itself or not? We know that at the individual level, if you have that kind of trauma, you keep reenacting it until you have resolved it.
Yeah.
So my question, as somebody who comes from psychology to dealing with groups on a bigger scale, is to say, are we doing similar things in our societies? Let's take Germany, for example. After National Socialism in Germany, they had to really engage to make sure that things didn't happen. We haven't actually done that because we were the winners. We won our liberation struggles. So we haven't actually looked at all the things that went wrong and the potential for these ways of being to manifest again. So it's not really surprising if you now see those systems being reproduced.
I think that's such a profound statement that you're making, and it's really, you're touching on a limitation of development as a field, but also on the grant side making of things. As an organization like the Open Society Foundations or like OSISA, understanding the time that is required in order for change to happen. Because we often sit with a frustration around, we understand that power does not yield without a demand, right? And we've often struggled to understand, with all the hardships that people in Zimbabwe went through, with all the hardships that communities in rural areas are living through on a daily basis, beyond just not knowing what their rights are, why is it that they are not demanding them? Why is it that they're not demanding accountability of the state? And you're really taking us back to understanding the psychology and the psyche of human beings and individuals in those spaces. And I think it's such a profound thing for us that pushes us to really rethink about the incremental changes, realistic incremental changes that we ought to be expecting from the investments that we make. And I think that's really, really a powerful thing that you're pointing to us there. I just had to acknowledge that.
Thank you. I'm glad that it's resonating.
So I want to jump to an actor, a very powerful actor in our society, or group in our societies, that we've hardly touched on, which is private sector. I mean, private sector plays a very important role in delivery of development, in the delivery of services, in the distribution of goods and services. And we have seen a trend, particularly on the parts of our governments, where there's a lot of privatization of public goods. And this privatization is sold as a way in which the state fixes efficiencies. What is your sense around what does a progressive private sector look like, and what is the role of private sector in facilitating developmental states?
Yes, well, we need entrepreneurs and we need the private sector. People have different abilities. So some people are good at running enterprises and making profit. The only issue comes when that profit is accumulated in one place and does not benefit the communities from which this profit has come. So we need those people who are good, otherwise this profit would never be made, and there would be no taxes, and we wouldn't be able to finance our hospitals and our schools, and also just to improve the quality of life. Enterprise improves the quality of life, it expands our choices, it delivers the goods that we need to us. So, you know, I think we're past that era where many people thought that we don't need the private sector. And even when we were in that area of socialism in the world where people said that we don't need the private sector, what did we see? We saw the state taking over the role of the private sector. So this tells us that private sector is something that is natural within human beings. We need it. So the question then becomes, how does the state engage? And really, we have to say the R word. The state engages through regulation. But it has got to regulate in a way that is receptive to the needs of the private sector. So we need a lot of interaction. The chapters that talk about the development of the Asian economies are very clear there about the different models that can be used and which models work better. So that really, for me, is the role of the private sector. It has to work with government to do the functions that government is not there to do.
Yeah.
Government is there to organize so that the private sector can produce.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to actually go back to the R word, and I guess you chose to say the R word because it's almost like a swear word, right? Talking about the state role, regulatory role, is something that gets a lot of, there's a lot of opposition around that. But you rightfully say that if we're going to look and learn from what other countries have been able to do, the Asian tigers, and the regulatory role and the benefits of it. And I think where even the idea of this book came from, having, looking at the economic crisis and the financial crisis of 2008, we actually realized that if the markets were left to their own without the regulatory hand of government, then we are heading for a disaster. But how do we get to a point where the question of the regulatory role resonates with a much wider audience in our societies and gains traction, even on the part of private sector? What kind of conversations do we need to be having, and where do we need to be having these conversations?
Well, I think we need to be having conversations about different economic models, different forms of capitalism.
Right.
Because we do have different forms of capitalism in the world. You look across the Atlantic, we have one form, and they're even beginning to question themselves about their form. They're looking to Northern Europe now, for example, where there is a welfare capitalist state. Maybe people don't like the word welfare because to them it speaks of lack of motivation and indigence. Well, we can find another word, but I think that's the kind of conversation we need to be having. We need to be having people who represent these different forms of capitalism in the room to talk to us about it and just for us to debate. The Scandinavian countries are said to be some of the happiest in the world. Holland, we hear that crime has fallen to such an extent that they're having to close the jails. So it is possible, even within capitalism, to find a mode of production where people who do input a lot do reap benefits from it, but at the same time, that those people who maybe are not functioning at precisely those levels can also have a dignified level of life. Yeah.
And what accompanies that is a different kind of democracy that happens, right?
Yes, absolutely. Now, I did a leadership course at LSE in 2012, and one of our lecturers told us that it is the Anglo-Saxon derived societies in the world that have the highest level of inequality.
Wow.
And I think if you look at it, you can see that that's true. Latin America also has a high level of inequality. But if you look South Africa, Namibia, the Botswana, the United States itself, these are all very high. So I think there is something there. And as we know, the Anglo-Saxons on their island of Great Britain have always dissociated them from Europe. And yet it is especially the Northern European and Scandinavian countries that have developed a mode of capitalism that seems more sustainable. Yeah.
What would be your parting words, having spent time reflecting on the question of democratic developmental states, having engaged with the book, what recommendation stands out for you about where we need to go as a region? How do we get to that point? I mean, we were deliberate in the title that we chose for the book, towards a democratic developmental state in Southern Africa. Because for us, it's an aspirational project. But what do we need to do? How do we get to the point where we can honestly, meaningfully declare ourselves as a democratic developmental state?
Yes, I think our activism has to change its nature. It also has to move with the times. So I think we have to look at that. What kind of lobbying are we doing, and for what kind of things, and how are we doing it? So that's number one. Now, a state has many sectors to it. So our lobbying is to power. What about our engagement with the silent majority? How do we change them from this almost tribal thinking? I was under my king, my chief, in my area, now I'm under my party. How do we change that kind of subject thinking to that thinking of a citizen? I am a creator of this nation, which is my reality. It is the process of changing them from subjects to citizens. And there's that wonderful book by the South African writer. What is her name again?
Rampele.
Yes, exactly. That talks about their process. This is something absolutely necessary. And even after the tribe was interfered with the coming of colonization, that subject mentality was still encouraged. And in my opinion, even during the liberation struggle, that subject mentality was still encouraged. The guerrillas would come in, they would assemble everybody and say, we are the liberating force, we know it all, we are going to teach you. So we've never actually had that moment in time where the ordinary person can say, I am a citizen and I am part of what determines this nation. So we have to get there. And I think that this also relates to the issue of the private sector, because it's only when you free your mind that you can be creative and come up with new solutions that people attach value to.
Thank you, Tsitsi. It's been a great pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you, Masego. I've really enjoyed it. It's been wonderful.